Hello, welcome back to FPL IQ. Today's FPL team guide is on Crystal Palace, where we are going to be looking at the predicted lineups of how we think they might start the season. We're going to look at their play styles, their strengths and weaknesses, as well as players to potentially pick and avoid from Crystal Palace. I'm FPL Whole Rob, and again, I'm joined today by teacher FPL Lucian. Welcome. How are you feeling about Crystal Palace before we get in the predicted lineup?
I've been playing FPL for 17 seasons now, and basically can relate to how Roy Hodgson feels right now. Really, the older we get, the longer we play this game, the more seasoned we feel, and there's always that nagging addiction to wanting to come back to play the game that we love so much. So let's get to it.
Yeah, I always feel like it's the most exciting part of FPL is that pre-season tinkering and watching the friendlies and changing to see what's hot and what's not kind of thing. So definitely like the wildcards during the season, it's one of the best times of the FPL season just before it all kicks off. So let's get into the predicted lineups, and there are a lot of question marks and possibilities for this Crystal Palace side. What we think is certain is going to be a 4-2-3-1 formation. So for some of these sides, I watch all the games. I'm sure you watch almost all, if not all of them as well. But I do like to contact some fans of the teams that follow them more thoroughly than what we would as general football fans. So for this one, I spoke to Palace fan FPL Jim, and he had similar ideas to what I had. So in goal, he thinks Guaita is going to start, but it's going to be between Johnson and Guaita. Both of them are good picks, I think, in FPL in terms of being 4.5 million. It's unsure at the moment. Johnson came in towards more the end of the back end of the season and did really well in terms of his FPL points, but who gets the number one jersey, we're going to have to wait and see for that. What is more certain is at least three of the back four. So that's going to be Mitchell at left back and Anderson and Gahey as the two central defenders. They're going to be like your nailed on players from the Palace defense. Right back, it is Ward's, sure, at the moment, but people think that they are going to be looking for a new right back to go in there. But in terms of the solid picks, it's definitely going to be the left back and two centre backs. Going to your more defensive midfielders, Decore and Lerma look like they're going to be the more defensive midfielders, with Etse playing in that number 10 central attacking midfield role. Now we get into the attack, which is a little bit of a mess. Now, usually you would have the season just gone, you'd have Olise on one wing and Zaha on the other, and down the middle could be Ayew or Edouard or Mateta. However, Zaha is now out of contract and he has received offers from elsewhere, so it's unsure where he's going to end up. Olise looks like he's going to be injured for the start of the season. So we've got a situation where we've got Ayew, Edouard and Mateta. They're usually fighting it out for the central position, but with some injuries in there, Edouard could start on one of the wings. If Zaha doesn't sign especially, they're going to have to go and get at least another winger and another striker in there because they've got some central attackers. You could see Ayew on one wing, Edouard on the other, and Mateta down the middle to start the season. It just depends on who they're going to bring in, whether or not Zaha resigns for Crystal Palace since it's expired his contract there, and how Olise's injury comes along. So it's a little bit of a mess up front, but we know the players, but we're not too sure how they're going to use them at the moment. And Zaha is just a question mark on whether he's going to stay or go. So how are you feeling about the Crystal Palace predicted lineup?
As FPL veterans, most of us are probably watching this channel too. We love messes because that is precisely when FPL towers will mess up their pricing. I think inefficiencies only come about when FPL towers wrongly price a player and making them severely undervalued. Balogun's a very good potential example here. Not too long ago in seasons past, there were 4.5 million strikers that did make a few game week 1 draft squads. Mine included. I think I went with Plunge at the start of last season. I do feel though that Palace's initial setup, although it does look like a 4-2-3-1, the pieces fit well, but in reality they play nothing of the sort. Palace currently, especially under Roy Hodgson, do not have the capability of playing a number 10 simply because they don't dictate games. I do wonder if they even need a 4-2-3-1 that relies on relationships and complex movement, or will they just stick to the simple stuff and run with a conventional 4-3-3? Left wing work with left wing back, right wing, full back, striker, things like that. Keep things simple, keep the center solid, and To be honest, if you ask me, the Kore and Lerma could potentially be partnered by arguably their player of the season last season, Jeffrey Schlupp, which basically hasn't been mentioned yet. I do feel that Jeffrey Schlupp's flexibility, being able to play in central midfield all the way up to left wing, has basically morphed Palace into a side that looked conventional, but depending on who Schlupp's partner is in central midfield, really put Palace either on the front foot in order to chase games or in a more structured, sort of tempo-ish kind of side, to give a sort of back and forth exchange, especially against stronger opposition. So that I can only say to that much, because without Zaha, everything changes. So we should look into their strengths and weaknesses now.
Yeah, just touching on first on what you said about Schlupp. Yeah, you're right. He is the definition of a utility player. He can play pretty much. He'd probably play in goal if you asked him to, right? So he could find himself on the left wing slot. Going into the strengths and weaknesses. So strengths in terms of FPL, not just playstyles. They're just a solid team. You pretty know what you're going to get from this side. They are usually always middle of the table in terms of every kind of stat in terms of defense and attack. But what's exciting about Crystal Palace, and I know Olise is injured potentially at the start of the season, but at least they've got some attacking options. In the past, it used to be Zaha, and people regard him as one of the biggest FPL trolls going in history. At least now with Eze and Olise, they have that lovely connection that it feels like a mini-me version of Son and Kane to an extent, but they're more attacking midfielders than that out-and-out striker. But they have a really good bond on and seemingly off the pitch. So, especially the fact that there's no one higher than 6.5 million for Crystal Palace. You've got 6.5 million for Eze and 6 million for Olise. Having that connection, you can choose one of them, and they're both really, really nice picks, in my opinion. Even though he's going to start the season injured, if they're fit, they've still got a couple of very cheap attractive attacking players who did really well towards the back end of the season, but also the defense. They're very good, that you'll talk about later, about being very good against the weaker sides. It feels like if you have to play a 4.5 million Crystal Palace defender or the goalkeeper, you feel okay about it. You don't look at them and think, wow, this is amazing, I'm so excited, I've got a Crystal Palace player in my side. But if you see them playing at home to Luton, you'd feel quite confident in a clean sheet from the defense. So overall, the strength of Crystal Palace is they're just like the definition of a mid-table Premier League side. They're fairly priced with players that have decent outputs. Any strengths that you have for Crystal Palace?
To be honest, I'd like to add on top of that, in sense that number one, their fluidity doesn't extend to partnerships between two players. I think we all recall a certain stretch of games where Wilfred Zaha was not available, and they did have to rely on Eze and Olise to carry the team forward. And with Schlupp playing as left winger at times, the real key player that made everything work was actually Jordan Ayew. From the right flank, he could play as a number 9. He could drift over to the left flank, create overloads. And this brought out the best in Tyrick Mitchell from left back, because when all the players squeeze into the left half of the pitch, they work wonders. There was this one point where Hodgson Edouard, playing as their default striker under Patrick Vieira at the time, was so fluid that the same 4 players, Zaha, Edouard, Eze, and Olise wasn't a starter at the time, so it was Ayew who drifted over. The 4 of them basically crammed themselves around the edge of the penalty area, and they just played all these 1-2 passes, and they set Zaha up for a 1v1 against a weak fullback. That is what Palace can potentially do. And I like what you say about mid-table team, because I think the difference between a solidly mid-table side and a relegation contender, for example, is that they do have some synergy worked out, either in their attacking third, or they have a sound strategy to shut teams out 1-0. So that's what we like about Palace at the moment, regardless of their FPL pricing.
So we'll move on to the weaknesses. So you've said that they can seemingly cope perhaps without Zaha, but I think a weakness is he is a big loss. It's all well and good to be without him for 3 games, 4 games, 5 games, but to be without him, period, I think that's a huge loss. And I haven't seen them really looking to replace him. They're still trying to re-sign him. but he has got some lucrative offers in Saudi Arabia. He's had some top European leagues after him as well. I think it might be a bit difficult, and they'll leave it. You don't want to leave it too late, right, to get someone into this system. But I'll talk about the elephant in the room as a weakness, and it is going to be Roy Hodgson. Yes, he did incredible when he came in. The first few games, it was like they were conceding 1 or 2 goals and scoring like 10 or 20. Like it was great, but he's 75 years old. It puts me off to deal with the high level stress in the Premier League. He's got all the experience. He came in, but let's not forget he came in where Crystal Palace had a run of really, really good fixtures. So we talked before about Liverpool, and I've mentioned when I talked about Trent Alexander-Arnold in that final 10 games of the season. In 5 of those 10 games for Liverpool, they played the bottom 5 clubs. Crystal Palace had a similar lovely green run. Like Vieira had to go through this horrible sea of red playing against, Arsenal, United, City. It was horrible. He had this big chunk of difficult fixtures, and they fired him after I think it was the Arsenal game. It was Arsenal, right?
Yeah,
And
we lost
then
4-1.
yeah, and so he loses to Arsenal, he gets the can, and then Hodgson comes in and he gets to play, like Bournemouth, Nottingham Forest, like it was just a. So how is he gonna be when they don't get that chunk of green fixtures and they go through that tough patch? Is he gonna have that energy and new ideas and thinking to get them over that? It's gonna be a difficult one. But we'll have to wait and see. He has a connection with Crystal Palace, but let's not forget he also did go to Watford and they got relegated when they were in a battle. He wasn't really in a battle with Crystal Palace. Your thoughts on weaknesses for Crystal Palace?
You mentioned how they had a run of good fixtures. After their opener against Sheffield United, they do play Arsenal, Brentford, Wolves, Villa, Fulham, United. Now, that is a run that is considered a mixed bag, especially with that sandwich of Brentford, Wolves, and Villa in between United and Arsenal. So Roy's potential will be severely tested in the opening 4 game weeks. But at this stage, we have to be reminded that the strength of investing in Roy Hodgson's Palace is that, Roy, I need to ask you, right? What would you think the mainstream media would believe if the headlines read Roy Hodgson gets 3 points against X team or Y team? Would it be a 1-0, 2-0 scoreline, or would you believe that it'd be like a 3-1, 4-1? What do you think?
Comes back to the strength of being a solid side. So I don't think they'll win games 5-0, but they'll probably grind victories out quite well.
Right. So, of the 5 wins that Hodgson secured last season, right, immediately after he took over following Vieira's sacking. So, the 5 wins came against Leicester, Leeds, Southampton, West Ham, and Bournemouth. So, teams that were, of similar strength in a similar situation. And so, okay, fine. We can probably bank on him to beat the likes of Bournemouth, Everton, Luton, Sheffield United, for example. And here's where things get really strange. Although he did grind out 2-0 wins against Southampton and Bournemouth, he had massively thrilling wins: 4-3 against West Ham, 5-1 against Leeds, and 2-1 against Leicester. So it's not all roses for Hodgson's side, in the sense that even though we can predict wins, we can't predict the clean sheet kind of wins, the solid kind of wins where we either pick a fullback that will get an assist and maximum bonus, or we can't predict perhaps an attacking midfielder that will score 2 goals in a 5-1 win. It's impossible to tell. We don't know which Crystal Palace will show up. That, for me, is the biggest weakness of trying to play FPL around Crystal Palace.
Yeah, they're just sort of like a jack of all trades, master of none, right? They'll do things quite well, but they're not gonna to blow your mind, really. So let's get into the top 3 picks. It's going to be no surprise for the top 2. I've already talked about them a lot. Number 1 and number 2, Eze and Olise when he's fit, of course. They've got that connection ahead in terms of how many points they pick that they actually pick up. The minimum 30 points ahead of all the other teammates. And Edse's slightly higher up. He's like 50 points ahead of everyone else in the team. They are the 2 key guys for this side. And you can be confident in, when fit, they're going to be on the first 11 without any worries of them getting dropped, because They've got a thin. We've already talked about how thin that attack is right now. You can't imagine them getting any rest. You know, they're not in Europe, so they can just focus on the league, really, right? But then going to the third pick, I just think the goalkeeper. So have a look at preseason. If Guaita's back or if Johnson's going to hold on to that number 1 jersey, I just think for the mixed bag of fixtures, that's a good thing for me because you can go for clean sheets in 1 week and save points in the other. I feel as though Johnson was getting a lot of bonus points and save points last season towards the back end. So I just think they are the main 3 that I would go for. Eze and Olise are way above everyone else. And then if you had to choose a goalkeeper, he wouldn't be high on my list. I'm not saying that Johnson or Guaita are great picks, but if we're trying to pick 3 from this side, it would just be Eze and Olise way up from everyone else, and then maybe the goalkeeper as like a, if you're rotating goalkeepers, for example, something like that, then that might be an option. Any standouts for you that you would pick?
And I tried to make a top 3 pick list out of this batch. I had Eze as my third pick because I did feel that he was the only player that was fairly priced. So really my target objective in terms of making a top 3 was to find gems that were undervalued. If I were to pick from their sea of 4.5 million defenders, I had basically have to choose between trying to identify the next Wan-Bissaka, right? Or I would have to choose a set piece defender. You know, perhaps someone would take set pieces to the same caliber of Milivojevic, and then we'd see a centre back score multiple goals. For me, that's still difficult to see. I think in pre-season, I will look at their set piece routine to see if I can pick up value from the defense from set pieces. Otherwise, in terms of attack, I am still strongly looking at Jeffrey Schlupp, not because everyone else is bad, but because of the addition of their creative force, Jefferson Lerma. I think the problem with Crystal Palace last season was that Doucouré was playing a really defensive role. He was basically sitting back there as number 6, and he would occasionally take shots from range. Now, that meant that he had 2 central midfielders playing ahead of him. One of them would usually be Jeffrey Schlupp. The other would depend on game state. If they were losing, they'd play someone aggressive like a Will Hughes. If they were leading, they'd play someone like a Milivojevic, or sometimes they even have Eze in central midfield just to back him up. I can't tell at this stage, but I do feel that Jefferson Lerma's arrival will be key. The moment he's integrated into the side, they have a left-footed creator and a right-footed creator that can supply the front 3. Because I strongly believe that Crystal Palace will not play with a number 10. They have absolutely no reason to. So instead of having one playmaker in between the lines, they will have 3 playmakers completely fluid up front, supplied by this creative duo in central midfield. I love it. So I do hope that one of Lerma or Schlupp will become the main man, because Schlupp is a player we all love. He absolutely deserves it.
I think that's only going to be, and we're going to have to wait until game week 1 happens, but I think that's where we separate slightly on how we think they'll set up, because I do think that I think Hodgson will stick with a 4-2-3-1, that sort of old school thinking, tried and tested. It worked for him last season. I think Doucouré and Lerma are an out and out defensive midfielders, and it gives, I'd say, that license to be that number 10 role, to be free and be that creative force in the middle. But we'll see how pre-season goes, and the loss of Olise might be forcing them to change it. So in terms of, we say traps for this part, or ones to avoid, or ones that we think people might look at and we would suggest that they don't. The one that I'm going to suggest for Crystal Palace, it's the strikers. Because let's say they're all fit. Olise's fit and Zaha resigns. They rotate a lot. It doesn't feel like that, even though they're like 5.5 million for Edouard. I use 5.5 million, but he's a midfielder. So if he's up front, that might give you a little bit more value, but it's likely to be on the wing. Midfield spots feel so precious this year because there's no good 4.5 million midfielder. So it's forcing you to go for 5 million or play 5 in midfield. We don't have a 4.5 million Pereira like we did last year. The midfield slots feel a lot more precious. So are you going to spend 5.5 million and play Jordan Ayew every week? No, I just think there's too much rotation potential between Edouard or Ayew or Mateta to be that central player. It felt like they were in and out. I think they'll start the season with Edouard, but don't be surprised after a couple of games where he's not scoring a lot, you see Ayew or Mateta get a run in the side as well. So my suggestion, and I don't think people would be going that way anyway. But if you were looking for a cheap striker, you want to play 3-5-2, Haaland's your big striker, you want a cheap guy next to him, and you see the likes of, Edouard at 5.5, and you think he's going to be the star striker or the main striker, I would look elsewhere for that. What would be your suggestions to avoid, or traps or things that you think people might fall for Palace?
I don't think you need an expert to tell you to avoid Crystal Palace attack for now, anyway.
No, it's a mess.
I think it's a good thing though that Zaha is not part of the picture now, because I do feel that no matter who looked stronger between Edouard or Mateta, eventually you'd feel that they would rather have Zaha playing as a number 9. I look at this side without Zaha now, and they are forced to go with the slightly more indisciplined Edouard or the more big and burly but really, really slow Jean-Philippe Mateta. Like, really, Mateta is just so big and buff but so slow. The spot is open, and I do suspect, especially with Zaha's departure, that the moment they buy a number 9, right, whether it's from the championship or some relegated team, that number 9 will almost certainly be the fulcrum of the entire side. So we're just waiting for Crystal Palace to buy a number 9. I'm looking forward to that, because that would basically upgrade the entire squad severely and almost certainly help us identify the new playstyle Hodgson wants to use this season. I think that's basically the missing piece. For me, really, I'd like to talk on the fullbacks a little bit, because we hope in all sincerity that we find new Aaron Wan-Bissaka. I love that boy so much. But, he was so good playing for Crystal Palace, and he was so underwhelming at Manchester United. And that's how it is, right? The league is full of all these athletic fullbacks that can get to the byline and put in crosses and look so good doing it, because Crystal Palace are a side that thrive on cutbacks and crosses from the flanks, from the byline, and we're just waiting, we're just really, really waiting for that one fullback to emerge. Unfortunately, I do feel that from this batch, out of these sets of fullbacks, the strongest fullback they have is actually Nathaniel Klein, who I don't know whether he's going to start this season or not, but that's about it. It's just a case of their skill set not matching their current crop of players. So that's why they're in a void for me, and I'd rather invest in someone like Anderson.
Klein, 19 starts he had last season, but we know he's got a bit of a history record with injuries, so don't be surprised if that's why I said earlier about the lineup. 3 out of the 4 defenders are pretty much easy, but the 4th one could change. So let's rate this team out of 10 in terms of FPL. I'm gonna change slightly. I'm gonna say 5 out of 10. That's just because if you play Eze or Olise, you feel okay about it. As a cheap option, it's not bad. If you have to play a 4.5 million defender, Palace rotate quite well with Newcastle. So Botman for 4.5 is going to be a popular pick. If you've got Mitchell and Botman rotating for the popular or solid fixtures, then that's not the worst. No, I'm going to say 6 out of 10. I'm going to stick to the original script, 6 out of 10, just because Eze and Olise are quite exciting, and you wouldn't mind playing a 4.5 million defender if you had to play them. They're not awful. If I find myself with a Palace, a good run of fixtures, and I've got a Palace player in my squad, I'm not going to, rip my hair out, ironically, about looking at them in my starting 11. What would you rate these guys out of 10?
4 out of 10, unless Nathaniel Klein starts. Then it'll be 5 out of 10. I mean, there's just no point. I don't think Crystal Palace will be a part of any conversation unless somehow multiple Sheffield United defenders get injured in pre-season. That's about it.
Mid-table score for a mid-table side. I think that's pretty it. So thanks for watching. Do you think that the Eagles will fly high this season under Hodgson, or are they going to fall flat? And who would you be picking that isn't Eze or Olise from this side? Because it feels like they're the only 2 main ones people are going to be choosing from. And do you even have any Crystal Palace players in your drafts to date? Thanks very much for joining, guys. We will be back next time with Everton, who will be hoping for a much better season than the previous after surviving on the final day of the season. So thank you very much for watching, and as always, have a good one.